Hey everybody, welcome to another model building workshop. And today we're going to look at the battle in 1939 that started World War II, the Battle of Poland. Dun, dun, dun. And I'm going to start this off by showing you a few good books that are out there on this first battle of World War II. So first we have The Invincible Black Brigade, and this is a Polish 10th Cavalry Brigade in 1939. This is by MMP Publishers, and this is a really nice overview of this unit of the Polish Army. It has great photographs of their armored vehicles. And it does a lot to explain the period prior to the war, and the war with Germany as well. And it has some nice color illustrations as well. So there's a lot of different books out there on this topic. You know, there's this series here, Osprey. And one from Stratus, which is on Polish tanks. This is just the Vickers 6-ton tank. And this also has a nice look at different armor that the Polish had. Vickers tanks, different types, and marking options. Tractors, etc. So that's that one. Sorry, the lighting is a little off here at Casa Allen today. Doing the best I can. And then we have, of course, Concord Publications has their series. That's the September Storm. This mainly has to do with the German forces in the Battle of Poland and their machinery, infantry, etc. So, we're going to look at some of the armored vehicles involved in this battle. And we're going to start with Poland. And I'm going to start with some of their tankettes. Now, tankettes sound like a kind of a silly term, right? What is a tankette? It's a tiny tank, right? And some of the reasons that tankettes were very popular in the 1930s was because there was a depression going on, right? It was a period of peace, just after, that period after World War I. And, of course, the stock market crashed in 1929 and the world plunged into a depression. So tankettes were a fairly affordable option for armored vehicles. So that was something that a lot of countries were looking at. It's a nice way to get a armored car or armored vehicle out there at, low money. And Poland had quite a few of them. So this is a TKS tankette. This is a small two-man vehicle. I should have brought the Volkswagen Beetle up so you could see it. This is smaller than a Volkswagen Beetle. Okay, so I'm trying to give you a sense of the size of this. I don't think I have a figure with me here. No, but this is a very tiny vehicle. And in some ways that's an advantage because this is small. So it'd be hard to find, hard to hit. Most of the TK tankettes, which this is one of them, this is a TKS, most of them were armed with a machine gun, whether it be a liquid-cooled Browning, and then they tested that one out. I think most of them were armed with a Hotchkiss machine gun. This particular one, however, has a 20 millimeter anti-tank gun. I believe it's a Soliturn, if I'm pronouncing that right, gun in here. So this had an extra punch to it. So this was actually able to penetrate armor of most German tanks in 1939. And one of these in particular had gone out on a mission and did successfully knock out several German tanks. So these had some value considering their tiny size and thin armor. And as you can see, the running gear and the treads are quite small. So you would think it would break down easily. But anyway, these served fairly well considering. But of course, as we know from history, the Battle of Poland, it was just an avalanche of German forces just imposing their will on Poland. But the Poles did fight back and had some moments, and this is one of the exceptions. Most of the Tankettes, like I said, were armed with machine guns, so this gives you an idea. This is just a casemate, because when you build these models, and most of these models are either from RPM, sorry, or Mirage Hobbies out of Poland. So, and you get a lot of options in these kits. So this is a extra parts. This was a casemate of a TK3. So you can see that this one would have had the little dusty Hotchkiss machine gun in this one. That's what that is. And of course there were other variations. So this one here is the TKD. And the TKD, this one was an experimental design that had a 37 millimeter short infantry supporting Puteaux cannon that was typically used in World War I with the French FT-17 tank. So this added a little bit of extra firepower, and this would have been used basically to take out machine gun nests and small, like pillboxes and things of that nature. So that's the TKD. There's also another type of TKD which had a bigger gun, which I can show you that kit later on. This is another TKS model with the 20 millimeter cannon. And you'll see these different markings that are on the Polish vehicles. These little plates that were put on with different colors there. The red and white Polish colors. And these were, different like platoon emblems and so forth. Most of these markings would have been taken off during the war with the Germans. They wouldn't have left those on for the most part. They would have tried to take them off because they would kind of make bigger aiming points. So among the experimental designs of the Tankettes, here's one called the TKW. Try to get that so you can see it. And this has a revolving turret. This was an experimental design. I don't believe this one actually saw any combat, but this is a way of getting the Hotchkiss machine gun into a revolving turret. You can imagine how cramped it was in this machine, right? So that was another experimental design. And they had a few other ones that they tried mounting different types of equipment onto, the tiny frame of the vehicle. Sorry, I'm having some issues here with the lighting. Not sure what else to do here. I'm trying to get this to work for you. Sorry. I'll pause for a second. Okay, so we're going to move on to the Vickers Mark E tank. And this tank is a derivative of the British Vickers E. I just showed you the book on that. And this one has a 47 millimeter cannon, kind of a low velocity 47 millimeter cannon, and a heavy machine gun in the turret. So this one has an improved Polish engine in it with large air intakes, as you can see. The original British design looked more like, if I can juggle this, like this. Put this one down for a second. You can see a different type of engine deck on it. So this is more typical of the British designs. This particular one is in the markings of the Bulgarian army, maybe like 1940. If you can see, as looking at these models, these have the rubber band tracks, which were, If I was to do these models again, they do sell individual length tracks for these, which are quite good. And I would recommend doing those because the rubber band tracks lack a lot to be desired. So anyway, so here's the Vickers E again in the Polish markings. And then a number of these, not a lot. The Polish armored forces were significantly outmatched by the Germans and outnumbered. So there was that one. And then developing that tank, the Poles began to work on their own variants of the Vickers tank, and this is the 7TP. So this is a twin-turreted tank, and it has the Browning machine guns, liquid-cooled machine guns in there, in the turrets. So the idea of this tank was to, mainly for infantry support. So the twin turret idea seems a little bit odd to us, but, in this age. But the idea of these tanks was to, if you were crossing a trench, right, and you were sitting over the trench, you would then be able to aim a machine gun down each length of the trench. So you could fire left and right into the trench and attack whatever troops were there. So it makes sense in that context, but it's hard to imagine that now because things have changed so much since then. But that's, the intent there. So as you can see, another type of engine on the back. The engine deck has been changed again to house a bigger and better engine. So that's the 7TP. This is the twin turret version. Now they moved on to a single turreted version, which is here. Oops. And this was a real threat to the German forces. This one has a Bofors 37mm gun in it. This has good anti-tank potential, and this was more than a match for the German tanks it encountered. Again, there were very few of these. There's, I think, only 2 armored units that were equipped with these, and they weren't very big. So they really didn't play a very big role in the battle. Although certainly capable, although the armor was still kind of thin on these. And again, a derivative of the Vickers E tank. So that's the 7TP with a single turret and the 37mm cannon. So that takes care of the Polish forces. Now if you hold for just a second, I'm going to pause and we're going to talk about the German forces. Okay, so I did have one other example of a tank that was used by the Poles, and that is the French the Renault R35. The Hotchkiss 35 has a similar look to it, but slightly different suspension. So this is an R35, French infantry tank. Has very thick armor and a short-barreled 37mm gun, the same one we saw on that TKD tankette, the little Puteaux cannon. This particular example here is marked in Italian markings that were in use with the tank battalions that were in Sicily when the Americans and the British landed. So this is an Italian example here. So a number of these tanks were supplied to Poland, but most of them fled to Romania and did not take part in the fighting in Poland. But that's the R35. Okay, now moving on to the German forces. So the Germans were equipped with a large number of tanks. And it starts with the Panzer I. Good place to start, right? Number 1. This is a Panzer I-B. It's a little bigger than the Type A. The Type A had fewer road wheels than this one. As you can see, this is a 2-man machine gun armed tank. It doesn't have a whole lot of, oomph to it really. These were designed mainly as training vehicles for the German army in the 1930s to begin planning for the expansion of the German armored forces. So these really weren't meant to go into combat, but combat came just the same in 1939, and these suddenly found themselves on the battlefield. And they did fairly well, considering. Just clever tactics, and lots of them. The 2 machine guns, it managed to do quite well in the battle. Although, as we just looked at, the Polish armor, they had a number of vehicles that could easily knock this thing out. So that's the Panzer I. This one's marked in the markings of the 1st Panzer Division. And you're going to see the big white crosses that were on these tanks. That's what the Germans were using as a national marking in 1939. This is so they could easily identify friend from foe. It became quickly apparent that the big white cross was a great place for Poles to aim their cannons at, so the Germans began to devise ideas of maybe we should think about toning that down a little. And I'll show you some of the ways they did that. So this is the Panzer I command vehicle. So they've toned it down by using yellow paint to try to cover up the white. So that gives it a little bit of, less glare, shall we say. So this is a command version. Basically what this does, it's cramped, because the Panzer I is a tiny vehicle. But this gives enough room for there to be a radio and a small map table in there for a commander to be able to look at a map and be able to radio his troops from the battlefield, on the battlefield. So this was a big innovation with the German army that really wasn't done much with other armies at this time, that the commanders were in the field leading the troops there from the front in vehicles like this. So they could see what was going on and communicate and make adjustments right then and there. And the fact that they had radios in the tanks is a huge innovation that many other countries hadn't got there yet. Even France wasn't quite there yet. So this is armed with just 1 machine gun for self-defense, but its real power was in the fact it could communicate and alter the battle with ease by being right there. And that brings us to the Panzer II. So here is a Panzer II Type D. So this is, again, this was designed as a training tank. So this has a 20 millimeter cannon and a machine gun. And this one, the Type D, is a little different in that it has a different running gear. This is an experimental running gear that they tried out. And a number of these were in use in Poland. This one's with the 5th Panzer Division here. And so they tried this out. They didn't really like this suspension in the long run. And most of these, after the Battle of Poland, most of these were shifted over to becoming flamethrower tanks, which is what happened by the invasion of Russia in 1941. They converted these to being flamethrower vehicles, and some later were converted again to be self-propelled guns by mounting captured Russian cannon on a boxed superstructure. So that's the Panzer II-D. And the suspension, just as a point of reference, okay, yeah, here it is. This is a Panzer II-F, which would have been in production in 1941. So, and this is the suspension they ended up adopting. Actually, it was an early suspension design of the leaf spring wheels. But there were some improvements made to the Panzer II. The initial Panzer II did not have, this was a squared off extra armored front, and they had a cupola on top instead of just the open hatch like you saw in the Panzer IID there. So this is the later one, but this one also got heavier and slower. So, pros and cons. Next in line would be the Panzer III. Now, to be fair, the Panzer III that I've got here, this is a Panzer IIIH. So this is showing up in 1941. This one has some improvements that were not in the Battle of Poland, so I just want to be clear on that. The Panzer III, I think E was like the mainstay around 39 and 40. So this one's from 1941. So we see now that it has a short-barreled 50mm cannon. That wouldn't have been there in the Battle of Poland 39. It would have had a 37mm gun. But this is here just to give you an idea of the category of like medium tanks that were showing up that the Germans are starting to field. So smaller gun, but you get the idea of what other tanks were showing up on the battlefield. And another one, just going with the math, would be the Panzer IV. Now this is a Panzer IVF. This is a bit after the Battle of Poland, but it's still pretty similar to what the Panzer IV looked like in the Battle of Poland. It would have a short-barreled 75mm gun like this one does. And this was a support tank. So this had the 75mm cannon to support infantry by taking out bunkers and fortifications and things of that nature. That's what this is designed to do. This particular example was built by my nephew Christopher a number of years ago now, and he's got it in a kind of a winter whitewash for the battles in Russia. Okay, carefully moving on here. Sorry about the lighting effects. We're having a lot of issues with this today. I do apologize for that. I've got several lights on to try to make this work in the sun, but it's still, not the best. I'm sorry. Moving on. So the Germans in 1939, prior to the invasion of Poland, which happened in September, earlier in the year, the Germans occupied Czechoslovakia. And with that, they seized the Skoda works and all of the Czech Republic's armament industries. So the Czechs had a couple of really great tank designs, which suddenly fell into the hands of the Germans. And the Germans were able to supplement their armored forces with all of these captured Czech tanks. So that added a couple of more armored units to the German army, like overnight. So, examples of that would be the 35T, which is right here. So this is a Skoda tank design, and Skoda is an automotive company in the Czech Republic. So it has an interesting suspension system there. This has a 37mm cannon. This had a really interesting pneumatic suspension and driving system, which is quite advanced for the time. And this was overall a very good tank. Again, you'll see the large white crosses for the start of the Polish campaign. So this was a very good tank. This did see its demise, shall we say, in the German army during the invasion of Russia in 1941. These were used extensively in the early goings of that battle. But they found out that the freezing cold temperatures in Russia did not bode well for this, and that pneumatic driving system just did not work well in that real cold weather. So, but these did do very well in the battle against Poland and against France in 1940. And some of these were converted to tractors and other things, and a number of these were sold to Germany's allies like Romania. The Hungarians also used the suspension system to create a number of their own vehicles. And that takes us to the 38T. And this is, I see some issues with the decals. This has been sitting around a while. This is an old Italia kit, the venerable kit from the 1970s, and they built this quite a while ago. And you'll see that it's in there's red and green markings of the Hungarian army. The Hungarians used these in Russia in '42. They were supplied lots of them by the Germans to keep the armored division in the field. Noticing these decals are starting to crack and fall apart at this point because this was done a while ago. So anyway, the 38T, again, this has a 37mm cannon. It's a Czech tank. It has a great suspension system. And this tank was very successful as a light tank. And this served throughout the German campaigns. This did very, very well in France. It did great in Russia for quite a while too. Eventually, it got withdrawn in Russia around 42, 43 because the 37mm gun just wasn't up for the fight anymore as the Russians began to put more and more heavier tanks out into the field. So this became outclassed. And again, typical German fashion, that means pass it on to your allies. So Romania and Hungary and Bulgaria suddenly found themselves able to buy these in large numbers, and they did. But again, the combat value by 44 and 43, this was starting to go downhill. What the Germans did in typical fashion, not wanting to waste anything, they used these chassis and ended up creating a wide variety of self-propelled guns, which led up to the excellent Hetzer anti-tank destroyer, which had some sloped armor and a 75mm cannon and a fixed box-like structure, and that was a fantastic tank hunter. So the chassis continued to serve on in many different ways because, you've got a good, dependable running tank. You got to use it for something, right? Another thing these were used for toward the end of the war was these would go on trains, and they would either use them as gun platforms on the train, or in some cases they would disembark from the train and go search out like partisans and rebel forces that were trying to blow up the train tracks and so forth, and use these as scouts to protect the train lines. Anyway, so this was in the Battle of Poland, and this is probably one of the better tanks for that battle. Fast, well armed. That's a 38T. So that takes us through the German armor of the period. And I'm going to very quickly go over a couple of Russian designs because the Russians also attacked Poland on September 17th of 1939 as part of the Nazi-Soviet pact. And what that did is it essentially carved Poland into two, with the Soviet Union taking part of it and the Germans taking the other part of it. And the non-aggression pact between the Soviets and the Germans, was put into play. Of course, that was really just a kind of just a way for Hitler to buy time because he wanted to attack Russia anyway, because that was his main goal. And it bought him some time, and then he was able to attack Russia in 1941, much to his own demise, really. Didn't work very well for him now, did it? But I'm going to show you a couple of the Russian vehicles that were used in the invasion of Poland. And, whoops, this is, sorry about the lighting. This is a BT-5. So there are a number of subvariants of the BT tank. Because it went from like 2 to, I think, 7. So there's a number of different variations. This is a BT-5. This is from around maybe mid-30s, I guess. So this was a very lightly armored, fast, mobile tank that had a powerful, like a 47mm cannon in the turret and high speed. This could also work as an armored car. The tracks could be taken off this, and the front wheel here could turn, so this could work as an armored car on areas where the roads were good. and then you could put the tracks back on it and make it a regular tank in areas where you needed to have it as a tank. It was a novel idea, actually invented by an American named J. Walter Christie. Cool, but eventually they began to realize it was slightly silly. Either it's a tank or it's an armored car. Why would you want it to be both? Make up your mind, right? So, but these were used in large numbers by the Soviet forces in the beginning of World War II. Many of these were destroyed during the fighting in 1941 when the Germans attacked. Not so much because the tank was bad, it was just because of the tactics and the surprise of the German advances that these just get gobbled up. So again, a very quick moving tank, a very effective tank. The United States, J. Walter Christie, they did try these, but the United States eventually rejected this design, which may have been a mistake. Anyway, BT-5. And lastly, that leaves us with the T-26, which, I think we've talked about this in a previous episode a while back. This is another extension of the Vickers tanks, which we just saw. The Polish Vickers and 6-ton tanks in the 7TP. So this is the Russian variant of the Vickers tank. This is the T-26, which you can see pretty much has a lot of the similar features. This is one from, I think, 1937. It has sloped turret armor, the 47mm gun. So this is a later version of the T-26. And as you can see, this has the Lincoln length tracks, which tend to be a lot nicer looking than the rubber band ones. This particular T-26 is marked in a Russian army, and as it was used in Iran, believe it or not. This was part of a operation where the Soviets rolled into Iran to meet up with British forces to basically seize a railway line so that they could have a rail line to support and send supplies, so the British could and the Americans could send supplies to Russia through Iran by rail once after the German invasion, where the Soviets suddenly became an ally. So to supply the Russian allies, the Americans and the British were able to funnel some supplies by rail through Iran and up that way into southern Russia. Anyway, this is the T-26, and this is also in use in the Polish campaign. And I'm going to show you a few other things before we go, so hold on just a moment. So as I was talking about, RPM and Mirage hobbies tend to be the ones that make a lot of these Polish tanks. New companies are joining in lately. So this is the track links, the separate link by link tracks you can get. And these help make your tank look a little nicer, as you just saw. So here's an example. Here's the Mirage 7TP kit. And here is another type of TKD. This has an open top with a 47mm cannon mounted on the TKS chassis by the looks. So this kit is also available. There's also a box kit you can get of the TKS or TK3. It's basically a big set where you get the parts to make one tankette, but you have all the parts to make any one of the options from the TKD. Well, maybe not this one, but the ones I showed you earlier, the TKW, the TK3, the TKS with the 20mm cannon. You get all of that in one super box. So anyway, so there's a number of things by Mirage and RPM. I think this one, yes, is an RPM one. So that's where you can get the Polish tanks. And some of the older ones out there from Model Tom, I believe was the name of it. So they're out there. Anyway, so that's our look at the Battle of Poland in 1939. Hope you enjoyed this episode. This is filmed from Casa Allen, and I guess the lighting could be better here, and I do apologize for that. But thanks for taking a look, and thanks for taking a look at my collection. Thanks, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.